Welcome back. This presentation and the ones that follow are a little different. From now on, I am looking at significant events and discussing their relevance and impact on Australian strategic policy. Specifically, I'm looking at the potential impact of these events on both the DSR strategy of denial and of the attritional strategy I recommended in my book and in an earlier presentation. Now, I've decided to do these presentations well after the trigger event happened, hence the secondary title of the long, slow look. I'm doing so mainly for two reasons. First, as in this example from the Sydney Morning Herald, there is always a great deal of short-term commentary in the media that is all too often based on very little data, and that data usually only becomes available in the weeks and months that follow. Secondly, any discussion that does actually follow is largely split along party political lines. I'm going to try and take out the knee-jerk reactions and the politics. I'm also trying a new style for those who watch these presentations on their phone or such. Hopefully, I haven't gone too far the other way. I also tend to look at these events quite differently. I hope, as a result, that you will find my viewpoint interesting. At this time, I am developing 3 different presentations. The next one will be on recruitment. The one after will be on the Chinese circumnavigation of Australia. Both are fairly well advanced. Finally, there is a little excitement over the New Zealand Defence Force revival. Apart from these 3 projects, there is nothing else that has happened to date for which I can add data or provide a different viewpoint. Now, I've delayed listing this presentation until after the UK Starmer government announced any financial changes to their defence budget. They had to increase the defence budget following the publication of their own Strategic Defence Review. The additional funds were announced on the 11th of June as part of a spending review by Chancellor Reeves. This is actually a very interesting document from an Australian perspective. Why it is will become clearer a little later, so bear with me. To start off with, this additional funding doesn't kick in until April 2026. That's nearly a year away, and the bulk presumably not before April 2027. Again, that's almost 2 years away. We'll know better with the MOD's 2026-27 budget. The increased defence budget includes over $500 million on security and intelligence. This fits into the EU's rather handy categorisation of what you can include in defence spending. There is also an additional £6 billion for munitions. Again, this is not surprising. The UK has run down its ammunition stocks supplying Ukraine, with over 12,000 anti-tank missiles and 400,000 artillery shells alone. Bluntly, at upwards of £2 billion, it's not the cost so much as how expensive it is to increase those manufacturing facilities and how long it will take. If not for that pre-existing Cold War stockpile, the UK simply could not have kept up with the ammunition needs of modern warfare. And that's another lesson for Australia. In this presentation, I am comparing the cost of Australia's defence with 5 other countries. They are the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, Canada, and New Zealand. It's often said that comparing defence budgets is like comparing apples and oranges, which is true to an extent. In this presentation, I am not just looking at the total budgets, but will use a rather fairly simple metric, and that is calculating the average cost of every single soldier, sailor, or airman. I've done this before in my book and an earlier presentation. Also, to save time and voice, and with apologies, I will just refer to members of all 3 branches as soldiers. Please note that I am not in any way, shape or form saying that the Canadians or New Zealanders handle their defence budget better than Australia, or that Australia should lower their defence budget to match. It's just that if you are going to let your defence force wither on the vine, then these are the savings you should be looking at. Equally, the real question is whether the ADF is actually so much better than the CDF that it justifies pretty close to $20 billion extra dollars in the Australian defence budget. Which brings us to the basic numbers used in this presentation. I'd like to make a couple of points. Project, build, maintenance, sustainment and operational costs are all included in these budgets. When trying to work out if Australia is getting the best for its defence dollar, This comparison is the only one we have, largely because of defence secrecy. However, we still need a better metric because all these countries have different sized defence forces, economies and military threats, hence my use of the average cost per soldier. Also, the exchange rates I've used are the highest for the first half of 2025. In doing so, I've made the other countries' budgets look the most they can be in Australian dollar terms. In other words, I'm doing my best to make it look as favourable as possible for Australia. In reality, at times this year, the exchange rates could actually make these comparisons worse by anywhere between 2 and 5%. Finally, 3 of these countries have seriously expensive inclusions in their budget that we don't. As an example, the Yanks and the British have one enormous expense that is not in the Australian budget, which is their nuclear deterrent. I have made no attempt to adjust their budgets to remove any extra costs. I really am trying to make this comparison look as good as possible for Australia. And yet, despite my very best efforts, Australian defence expenditure is simply far too high for the size and strength of the ADF. Remember also that the cost of the AUKUS program is still yet to really bite. Since I wrote my book barely 3 years ago, the yearly cost of the average Australian in the Defence Force has increased by over $150,000 for each one. This is pretty depressing when you consider what has actually happened to the ADF in the last 3 years. There are a couple of very interesting subsets to these figures. The cost of the average American soldier has blown out by about 30% in the 3 years since I wrote my book. On one hand, this seems incredible, but on the other, around 10% of this increase is largely due to exchange rate movements. Take that out, and their growth rate is about 20%, or the same as Australia. However, exchange rates are actually part of life, so for the moment, I'm going to leave the American growth rate unchanged. That's because it gets a bit murkier. The American defence budget was increased this year through additional funding in their reconciliation bill that was just passed by Congress. It was supplemental to their normal defence budget. While their defence budget covers normal expenditure on munitions and builds, it's pretty hard to budget for the unexpected war like that with the Houthis or the new initiatives such as Golden Dome, which means that a reconciliation package increasing the defence budget is really not that unusual. It is clearly military spending, so I have included it in the total US defence budget, but it does make that average cost per American soldier very interesting. You can see why in the above list of the major items covered by this reconciliation bill. If you reduce the American total defence expenditure by all these items, then the increase in the average cost of an American soldier drops well below 20% over the last 3 years, which means that the average cost of an Australian soldier is actually increasing faster than his American equivalent. The really interesting thing, and this is why I've banged on about this probably a bit too much, is whether there is anything comparable in the Australian defence budget to the items in this supplemental funding. If you very generously say that there is additional funding in our budget compared to the ones noted by a question mark and leave them out of the totals, the percentage increase in the cost of an average American and Australian soldier is almost identical. In other words, while our Navy and Army is shrinking and our Air Force is stagnant, the costs keep growing and it's hard to know why. It really does make the cost of defence in Australia look unacceptably high. There are, of course, still differences in comparing these budgets. Pay for members of the Japanese Self-Defence Force is simply appalling, even by Japanese standards. An Australian recruit earns 3 times as much as his Japanese counterpart. Even after 2 years, an Australian will still earn about double. They also have some rather strange ideas about estate management and financial obligations, though things are changing for the better. Still, improved pay and conditions would not add that much, only roughly $50,000 a year. Even if you double that, a JSDF soldier is still $250,000 cheaper than their Australian counterpart, and that's every single year, and that's despite their current acquisition program leaving ours for dead. Previously, I used the example of 100 Australians, roughly the size of an infantry company or the crew of a frigate. Every year, an Australian infantry company costs $12 million more than their British counterpart, $34 million a year more than their Canadian counterpart, and an astonishing $54 million a year more than a Japanese infantry company. Only an American infantry company costs more than its Australian equivalent. Is there a better metric than the average cost of a soldier? Yes. Certainly, we should look at compiling a range of data from actual weaponry received, the individual cost of items, if there are any advantages from economies of scale, the average time spent in the field or at sea or in the air, and even disadvantages such as the cost of distance and poor infrastructure that severely impacts both Canada and Australia. However, the best authority to gather and compile this data is the Australian Defence Department, yet, for some reason, they are reluctant to do so. Back in March, when I started collecting data for this presentation, I was also going to look at the issue of the Alliance in terms of defence acquisition. At that time, I thought we would face four main problems that we would need to manage. They were America will demand increased defence spending, that within Australia we will see domestic political demands to stand up to President Trump, that there are several structural weaknesses in American defence production, and Kevin Rudd. I discussed my concerns about the Australian Ambassador to the United States, Kevin Rudd, whether they were fair or unfair, in my presentation on the risk to AUKUS, so I'm not going to look at that again. I also discussed my concerns over American naval production and its implications for Australia, both in the same presentation and the earlier one on defence procurement. Quite simply, there are others out there with much better resources and knowledge on American naval and missile production problems than I, so I'm not going to return to that one. There's simply nothing that I can add. The one that is open for discussion is American demands for increased Australian defence expenditure. Many, including myself, agree with the Americans. However, as early as in my book, I warned against a specific target, as a main result would just be further waste within the Australian Defence Department, combined with a lack of results. What really surprises me now is the apparent lack of any forethought in how Australia should respond to American pressure, and that is where my interest lies. The never-ending question for junior members of any defence agreement is how best they manage it without losing sovereignty, nor conceding the very outcomes wanted from that agreement. I've raised sovereignty issues before in my presentations on the sword and the shield, so I'll not force you to listen to that again. What I specifically wish to discover is whether we can satisfy American demands and still achieve Australia's outcomes just through re-evaluating defence acquisitions. There are two outcomes we need. The first is, no matter what guff the DSR goes on about, the very first and the very last pillar of our defence, and every single pillar in between, is that the most powerful military machine in the history of the Pacific, the United States Navy, will be there if we need them. In many ways, the AUKUS program, the subsequent implementation of the DSR, and the resulting changes to the ADF has actually dramatically increased our dependence on this pillar. This development is bad for both America and Australia. Still, realistically, and despite long-term concerns, this outcome is not at risk during the term of this administration. However, we do need to consider how the wider American political leadership on both sides will view our response to their demands for increased defence spending. All right, the second outcome we desperately need is for the AUKUS program to succeed. Perhaps more importantly, the part of the AUKUS program where we receive 3 Virginia-class submarines before 2035, though in all honesty, even that timescale is far too long. Many of you will know that I am no great fan of either the DSR or the AUKUS program, but the reality is that the ADF's capabilities have declined quite dramatically because we have bet everything on these submarines. Quite simply, AUKUS must succeed. Now, I believe there are solutions to both the problems I've listed and the outcomes I believe we need. Unsurprisingly, seeing I flagged it at the start of this section, it's all based around defence acquisition. The aim is to satisfy American demands for increased spending, not disrupt the current government's budget strategy, provide options for future Australian parliaments, and take advantage of the notion of what I described as fluidity in defence budgets. Now please note the aim is not to pull the wool over the eyes of the Americans. They know as well as anybody else that you just can't increase the size of the Defence Force overnight. Now I have no doubt there are better ideas out there. I'm not hearing them, but I have no doubt they're out there. So consider what I am listing here as debating points. Now I'm recommending building an additional 3 GP frigates overseas in addition to what we build here. In addition to the construction of the Australian LUSV, we place an order for an American LOSV and perhaps an option for 1 or 2 more. Order a 4th tranche of F-35s to replace the Super Hornets. However, we don't get rid of the Super Hornets. We mothball, and I'll explain that why later. We can announce an extension of the Redback production, and there's a question mark that I'll look at later about New Zealand. And we should really bite the bullet and to actually start massively expanding Australian industrial capacity for munitions, but especially drones. Now, excluding the GP frigates and the drone expansion, the aim here is to involve American industry, which, with an administration focused on US jobs, will be welcomed. Nor will the additional orders impact our government's focus on jobs from Australian naval production. Combined, all these announcements alone would add about $14.5 billion over 10 years. This works out at under $2 billion per year, but with most not hitting the budget in any significant way in the life of this government. Equally, it provides future Australian governments with options that, if they decide not to go ahead with, they must justify. However, it's still not enough. Now, there is a great deal of what I call fluidity to what is included in a defence budget. As an example, civil defence in Sweden is included, while the Japanese include their Coast Guard. By the way, removing the Japanese Coast Guard from their budget makes their comparison with Australia even worse. The Americans also include their Military Sea Lift Command in their budget, and of course they have a Space Command that actually does something. This actually creates one of my little detours, though I will be quick. The Australian Space Command is a type of waste our Defence Department is really good at creating. Ideally, we would try to provide it with meaningful tasks and the funding it needs to achieve those tasks. Unfortunately, at the moment, its main role is to provide positions for ADF seat warmers who are access to requirements. Blind Freddy could see this was always going to happen, and in fact, I warned in my book that it should become an independent branch with its own funding. Under its original structure, when money became tight, it would always lose out to the Air Marshal's favourite toys. Now, as part of the Joint Capability Group, it loses out to cyber. I find myself quite annoyed by what is purely and simply military tokenism. The Australian Defence Space Command is our equivalent of a Salvador Dali surrealist painting. Far too expensive and just plain disturbing. Anyhow, back to the main point. I emphasise civil defence far more in my book than in my presentations, largely due to their length. Regardless of American pressure, the creation of a civil defence arm is absolutely crucial both to protect Australians and encourage debate on the threat from China. However, in terms of increasing the defence budget to satisfy American demands, it can play a major role. Therefore, the recommendations are a professional civil defence agency in addition to the volunteers, creating a paramilitary Coast Guard out of the Australian Border Force's patrol fleet, a paramilitary merchant marine, and, as weird as it may sound, a paramilitary reserve air force. What's interesting is that for achieving favourable Australian domestic opinion to increased defence spending, most of these agencies actually have multiple functions. Yes, they are part of Australia's ability to wage war, but they are also there for natural disasters, both here and in our wider region. Equally, in a greater Pacific war, they will all play a role in helping our ally, even if it is just through protecting and maintaining Australian infrastructure. In summary, our defence budget is far too high for what we have. Our government is possibly about to put AUKUS at risk, and our acquisition pipeline is not providing options for future Australian parliaments should they need them. So, allow me to provide a more uplifting ending. My next presentation is on defence recruitment. Its findings will have you thinking that today's presentation was actually positive.